I'm going to talk about intonation in a tone language. I like that I'm talking about tone languages. I'm sort of obsessed with them. That's what I do. Also because I think it's important to remember, especially in a conference like this, 50% of the world's languages are tone languages. So looking at intonation should include also investigating intonation in a lot of these languages. And so one question that comes up immediately is, where is intonation in tone languages? Where might we find it? This is sort of a quick and dirty summary of a lot of different work that's been done. It can be the case that pitch accents might not occur in a tone language, or they might be very minimal. There might be one pitch accent or something. You may have boundary tones, but they also may be absent. And in an interesting way, boundary tones might actually be restricted to occurring with very specific tones in the language. But what I'm going to focus on, instead of pitch accents and boundary tones, because I'll tell you they don't occur in Triqui, is what I call intonational effects. And this is, I guess, sort of a lazy term of mine to talk about phonetic effects that seem to be intonation-like, that occur layered on existing tones and can cause things like F0 register shift or F0 range fluctuation, meaning expansion or contraction of the F0 range. And some of these types of effects have been observed in tone languages. So what do I mean by register shift? Actually, this relates back to what Emiliano was mentioning earlier. Here's an example from Mandarin, the sentence "Mao mi mo Mao mi," meaning the kitty touches the kitty. I'm not a Mandarin speaker, but if you are a Mandarin speaker and you utter the first kitty with narrow focus, it's higher than the rest of the sentence. So you can have a shift in the overall F0 register as a function of focus. So what I'll be talking about today, I'm not going to be talking too much about the background literature because there's a lot of data. And I'll be talking about a language I've worked on for about 15 years, Itunyoso Triqui. It possesses a complex tonal system. There are no pitch accents or boundary tones. And so then, does the language show evidence for intonational effects elsewhere, such as in the realization of different focus types, or at things like utterance boundaries? Is there some sort of prosodic boundary effects that show intonation? So this is a picture of the Triqui region. So here is Mexico City, and here's the elbow part of Mexico, where Oaxaca, the state of Oaxaca, is located. And on the western part of the state, in this region here, I've blown it up. This is the Triqui region. There are 3 dialects. In the black diamonds is the largest dialect. It's the Copala dialect, which has about 20,000 speakers. In the blue circles to the east, we have the Chickahuasla dialect, which has about 4,000, maybe about 4,000 or 5,000 speakers. And then the 2 red stars are the Itunyoso dialect, spoken in 2 towns, with about 2,500 speakers. Some aspects about the phonology of the language, and in particular the tonal phonology. One thing I want to also, something that I always, in giving talks about tone, something I struggle with, is this assumption that tone languages are all monosyllabic. And that's not true. It's certainly not true. It's true in Chatino, I suppose, in Kiaihe Chatino. But it's not true in a lot of languages, in particular in Triqui. Most words are polysyllabic. There are monosyllabic roots in the table here, for instance, but they're not most words in the language. There are 9 lexical tones in the language, and these contrast in final syllables. Tone in non-final syllables is often redundant, and it's realized via a process of leftward tonal spreading, where the final tone is determining the tone on the non-final syllable. I have some papers where I've talked about that. But there is also contrastive tone on that non-final syllable, and it's also morphological. And I'll show an example in a minute. So there's a data set here to show you the types of tones you get depend a bit on the type of coda you get. So there are 2 possible codas, either a glottal stop or an H. And so you have 9 tones that occur in open syllables. I'm sorry, 8 different ones that occur in open syllables, 8 different ones that occur with a final H, and then the 4 level tones that occur with a final glottal stop. One of the rising tones only occurs with a final H, that is the 4/5 rise. And so you have examples here like yo, 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 ra, 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 for instance, for those 8, and I could pronounce the other ones, but I won't go into that right now. Okay, so final syllables are bimoraic. As I mentioned, they consist of it's either really a long vowel or a syllable that has a glottal stop or H coda. The reason I'm talking about these they are also prominent. So prosodically prominent, they're stressed. Most of the phonological contrasts occur on them. Nasalization contrast, full tonal set, a lot of phonological contrasts occur in the final syllable of the root. And tone is a high morphological load. It marks person, aspect, a few other distinctions. So you could have sets like this for the verb to eat. There's a perfective form cha. I ate, though, is cha. Chare is you ate. Ja is someone ate. Cho is we ate. Ja is someone will eat. Ja is I will eat. Ja is the aforementioned will eat, and jo is we will eat. So tone and some segmental changes are indicating aspects of morphology too. What about intonation? Well, there are no toneless words or morphemes whatsoever in Triqui. Everything is tonally marked, and there are no pitch accents. So in the process of working on this language, as well as on a larger grant that I have looking at prosody tone interface, I collected a lot of examples of looking at sentences that consist of all the same tone. And so here's just an example of the beans fell under the cat. Oops. Okay, you shouldn't hear much movement there. It's all tone level 3. It's pretty monotone. And in fact, if you were to place a cursor here, it's basically the same exact F0 as if you placed it here. So that's, I should say this is not only what happens with higher level tones, the lower level tones are similar. Okay, so Megan asked a question to me, Liana, too, about final particles. There are a lot of final particles in Triqui. There are about 24 of them as I count them now. They have some interesting phonology and so on in relation to segmental aspects, but they don't seem to influence the F0 of preceding tones. So I have 2 sentences here. They're the same except for the final particle, and the sentence is, are you going to buy some huipil pieces? A huipil is the dress that a woman wears, and she could buy pieces of it, let's say. And so there's a final question particle, ni, and then there's also a final particle that means something like apparently, or they say you're going to do this, and that's ra. And so they importantly have different tones. One's the highest level, 4, one's the lowest level, 1. And I'm going to just play these sentences for you.
Kiraring otukwani. Kiraring otukwani. Kiraring otukwara. Kiraring otukwara.
So you can hopefully hear that the final words have different tones. And you might think, well, maybe the rest of the sentence was influenced a little bit by that final particle. Well, here I'm going to play it without that final particle.
Kiraring otu. Kiraring otu. Kiraring otu. Kiraring otu.
Not much difference there. No. Okay, so the questions that are open are, might tones have alternate realizations under different information structure contexts? Are there boundary tones? What happens to tones at utterance boundaries? And these are the types of questions we're looking at. Okay, so what might we find intonational effects? We can look for focus. Focus might be marked by phonetic lengthening, register shift, range expansion, some of the things that I've mentioned. Final lowering may occur for all tones. It might be restricted for certain tones. So these are a couple places we could look. We could also look at declination. I won't be looking at I have declination data that I haven't analyzed yet, but I have, that's another area one could look for intonation in tone languages. But we're going to start looking at information structure.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'd like to begin by discussing a little bit how we came to settle on the experimental design that I'll be discussing today. So the population, the Itunyoso Triqui population, is mostly literate in Spanish, but pre-literate in the indigenous language. And that matters because lots of previous work that investigated prosodic realization of focus involved reading tasks where people would read things where the context would be controlled in the discourse. We couldn't use that. On top of that, we weren't able to use, Christian has a sizable corpus of spoken Triqui, but it doesn't control tone or, yeah, thank you, tone or word structure. So that was sort of not possible either. So what we settled on is a question and answer paradigm where a native speaker would tell a short story to a participant and then ask content questions involving the story. And that works for a particular type of focus, like informational focus, narrow focus, but it's not very useful for our all new questions. If you ask someone what happened, you're going to get a lot of different answers. So we decided for broad focus, we would instead use repetition. So the native speaker would say the sentence and then the participant would repeat it. So we used a mixed design for those reasons. So our methods are as follows. Each response was repeated around 5 times by each speaker, and there were 3 focus conditions we were interested in: all new broad focus, narrow contrastive focus, and narrow information focus. And the recordings all took place either in the village where it's spoken or in a very nearby city called Tlaxiaco. There were 50 target words that we were investigating with the following tonal contours, which Christian introduced before, and also we were interested in whether looking at monosyllabic roots and disyllabic words, as well as whether the word had a coda, and if it did, whether it was an H or a glottal stop. We had 11 participants and a total of 8,250 utterances, which we segmented and analyzed in prod with a script. There was normalized F0 trajectories, which we took 5 time points out of each syllable to get those and converted them with log normal values, in addition to taking syllable duration data. And this was all analyzed using a linear mixed effects model with LMER test. So if we were to begin to look at some of the results that we found, there are 2 figures on the slide. They are looking at duration in monosyllables, monosyllabic words on the left and disyllabic words on the right. And what I wanted you to take away from this is there's a pattern whereby focus in contrastive and narrow, so the narrowly focused contexts have a slightly higher duration than those in broad focus, which are the ones on the left. So the 2 right groups have a higher duration than the left, and also that words without a coda show greater lengthening than words with a coda, and the ones without a coda are the blue. And you can see that pattern easier in the left, but that the pattern is also evident in the disyllabic words as well on the right. So, in addition to duration, we were interested in looking at tone, and what we found is not much actually. So this slide has three figures categorizing tone by level, rising or falling, and each color represents a tone, and each tone has those 3 conditions, and you see that they're mostly overlapping with one another, and particularly that's true for the lowest tones. That's tone 1, 1, 3, and 3, 1. To finish my section, we found no general effect of narrow focus on F0 across the tonal categories, but there was a significant effect for tones with a glottal coda, which we didn't show. The figure's there, and if we have time, we can look at it. So we might ask, why is F0 lower in broad focus cases, which I'm stipulating, but you could see it later if we have time. Why would that be the case? So we came up with this explanation that glottal codas, so it's right here. Glottal codas induce F0 lowering due to co-articulation, and that in cases where there's hyperarticulation, where you're speaking more carefully, there's less co-articulation. And so cases where there's narrow focus, you're going to find this lowering attenuated. Thank you. And so we also found that words are longer in those cases, which we saw on the first results slide, and that open syllables lengthen more than closed syllables, about 20% as opposed to 5 to 15%. And there were some specific tonal effects, those higher tones, tone 4 and tone 3, but they're very small. And then I'm going to bring it back to Christian to talk about that last experiment.
Okay, so for the second experiment, we looked at positional effects. And for here, we were looking really just at the disyllabic words. And we looked at 10 different tonal melodies in either utterance final position or non-final position. So you had a sentence like kira ngo china, they bara wipil, and then kira ngo china nikya, they bara wipil in tlaquiaco, for instance, where the target word wipil, china, is no longer final. Basically, you could think of this as final, non-final, however you want to think of it. The pre-target word always was preceded by tone 2. The post-target word always had following tone 3. And we had about 400 repetitions for each speaker, 10 speakers. The methods were basically the same for the analysis of the duration and F0 data as in the first experiment. So I'm just going to jump right to the duration results here. And you're looking at disyllabic results now with syllable duration on the y-axis and word position down here on the x-axis. But on the top here, each panel reflects the utterance position. This is utterance non-final and utterance final. And one thing that you'll notice is right off the bat, final syllables are longer than non-final syllables. Well, that's true for both contexts. And I already mentioned to you final syllables are prominent, but so prominent syllables are longer. Okay. But one thing that's interesting here is that there is greater lengthening in utterance final position than in non-utterance final position. And similar to the data from focus, words that have a final open syllable are lengthened more, again, than words that have a coda. Okay. All right. What about tone? So this is an easy figure because the only things that are significant are the ones I've already highlighted. Nothing else is significant. Tone doesn't seem to change as a function of utterance position, except in these cases. So if you have a melody 3 to 4, that is the tone 3 on the penult and tone 4 on the final syllable right here, there's a little bit of a difference in slope in utterance final position. And if you have a falling tone, this high 4-3 fall and 3-2 fall, and they occur in utterance final position, they seem to fall more than they would when they're in utterance non-final position. So final syllables are longer than non-final syllables. They're lengthened. As in the focus data, open syllables are lengthened more than closed ones. There's a minimal effect of utterance position on F0, but no effect on any other tonal melody. Tones seem to be consistent, regardless of the utterance context. However, I mentioned this thing with these falling tones, at least for the falling ones, the 4-3 and the 3-2. We actually looked at the slope differences because we were looking at normalized data here, taking away the durational information, and it turns out that utterance final or non-final position, the slope is the same. So it seems like the slope is held constant, even though maybe it's falling a little bit more in utterance final position. So where is intonation in Triqui? The F0 of tones is unaffected by changes in information structure and utterance position. Prosody influences syllable duration, and my sort of working hypothesis here is that this permits speakers a larger durational window for the hyperarticulation of contrasts on the word. In Itunyoso Triqui, however, F0 does not seem to be one of the parameters that is hyperarticulated. It doesn't seem like speakers are really manipulating this. It has to be held constant. And I think that this is in line with work showing that speakers might be inconsistent with their use of pitch accents, but maybe consistent in degree of supralaryngeal hyperarticulation. And if we think about functional load in relation to the Triqui data, F0, I've mentioned it varies with tone, but it also varies with the coda consonants. So if you have a coda, the coda laryngeal can influence the F0 to a certain degree as well. So F0 varies along those dimensions. prosodic lengthening, I've also mentioned, you might say, oh, there's not much lengthening there. It actually is a strong cue to the coda contrast, and it's also phonemic and consonant, so there's a limit maybe in a way that you can't lengthen even that much, even if you want it to lengthen. I think that the word prosodic complexity restricts the degrees of freedom for the phonetic realization of intonation. One way that I'm continuing this work is by looking at declination in utterances, looking with different final particles, and we have some corpus work on this, and this is sort of part of a larger project looking at supralaryngeal articulation as well. Thank you.
Thanks. Shalom Gooden, University of Pittsburgh. I wanted you to go back to talk a little bit more about the methods that you used to elicit this wonderful data. The methods you used to elicit the data.
Which experiment? The focus?
So no, the data collection itself. So for the main study that you did.
The focus study? There's
Yeah,
two
so
studies. This one?
Right. So the slide before that, I think you mentioned low literacy levels.
Yes.
Yeah, right. So I wanted you to talk about how you got the data.
Okay,
So
so
how did you, yeah.
how I got the data. So we created a series of texts. We created, I was in the field and I've been working with certain consultants for a long time. And I wrote a first sort of draft of a short text in Triqui. They fixed it and we came to a conclusion so that we would have a short text that each of them told a short story in the language. And the answers, then we asked, these stories were then produced by the consultants, and the subjects then gave answers to questions that their interlocutor would ask them. So you hear a story about a rabbit, and then you asked, who ate the carrot? And the answer is the rabbit ate the carrot, and that's giving you narrow focus, but it's all in Triqui. It's all elicited in Triqui because we've come up with these texts beforehand for that type of, for eliciting that data. Okay, a short story. So in the first part of my grant, I trained speakers in literacy, and we've transcribed hours of text, of spoken discourse and conversations in Triqui, and they've been trained in literacy, and then we come up with a version that we have written down, and they read from it because they're literate, but not many other people are. Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Adam Royer. I was wondering if you're also planning, so you're planning to look at declination across the sentences, but I'm also wondering if you're going to look across like maybe pitch range declination as you get through like a larger discourse, so like the stories, for example, and if you might find something on like a bigger scale than just looking at the sentence, but in a series of
Finding
sentences.
like range variation.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
like as you get, maybe lower or more compressed range as you get through the discourse, or when you switch paragraphs or topics or things like that.
I haven't thought about looking at range across natural discourse that way. I think one of the difficulties is that your measurement of range is always going to be dependent on whether or not you're getting local examples of the lowest and highest tones. And so, I suppose one could do it with other tones too, but one expects specifically within a language like this, the area where there is flexibility in tonal realization is at the floor and at the ceiling of the F0 range. So it's going to be the lowest and the highest tones. And the lowest tone tends to only occur in adjectives and a few other contexts, but I think I think it'd be possible, but might be difficult to find local contexts where you have examples of the absolute bottom of their range right then and the highest part of the range then. That's the challenge to it.
I'm Wilmar, and I have two questions. Well, basically, the first one is like, simply if you remind us about the amount of data, well, that you collected, among the utterances that you collected.
The what?
And the utterances, the tokens that you collected, and also if pitch scaling was not like part of the variation in the amount of data that you had. I mean, like how high the fundamental frequency was, or how low it was across speakers. That is the first one.
Okay.
And the second one is related to the community. As you are working with a community that, from my understanding, they are bilingual. They speak Spanish and Triqui.
Yes.
Yeah, and then if you're ruling out that, like, well, the first thing that I would think is that maybe Spanish can make some influence in the tonal language.
Okay.
And I would like simply to know if there is any way or there is any effect from the tonal language into or on Spanish stress.
Okay, so the first question is, I don't have data right here on the pitch range by speaker. I could extrapolate that out of the tonal data, but I don't have I didn't look at pitch range by speaker, but I was just, ostensibly you get that data out of looking at the lowest tones and the highest tones in different contexts. So, I don't have data just looking at range here. To answer the second question, I think it's really important to distinguish between bilingualism in the sort of context of the US and bilingualism in the context of Mexico. And so bilingualism in the context of Mexico is everybody speaks Triqui. Spanish has to be used at school, but when you're not at school or talking with somebody official, you only use Triqui. Versus, and in that context, I don't think that there is much Spanish influence on Triqui. And my impression is that I don't think that there's any, really. It's usually the other way around. It's usually that the Triqui is heavily influencing the Spanish, and people's ability in Spanish usually is a very sort of local dialect, or it's very restricted to certain contexts. It's diglossic, really. That's my impression.
Michael Wagner from McGill University. I have a methodological question. So you said for the focus experiment that you used repetition to get the broad focus.
Yes.
And I was wondering whether you've considered two risks of this. So first of all, I think it's successful to make sure that you have broad or wide focus. But it comes with two potential risks. And one is repetition might have the effect that words are reduced in duration, intensity, and maybe F0 is reduced. And if I remember right, you found a lower F0. So that the fact that it was a repetition in the broad focus condition, the fact that
I
it was...
didn't find a lower F0 in the broad.
Oh, maybe I misremember then, yeah. And the second risk of using this is that while it's a successful way of assuring that it's wide focus, in English, for example, it's not an innocent choice for intonational choices. So if I say last week I forgot my hat, then you ask me what happened this week. I forgot my hat. I would be likely to use the surprise redundancy contour. Mm-hmm. So I might be using intonation to flag that it's a repetition. So it's just sort of a methodological point, I guess, about the manipulation.
So I guess, and this is the right audience to ask this, how do you suggest you both control for the local tonal context and avoid a repetition, avoid using repetition?
So, I mean, I'm not sure I'm the best person in this room to answer it.
I mean, I've pulled my hair out about this question.
Yeah.
And I've told people I need to get people that work on information structure and prosody into the same room and lock the doors until they have an answer for me. Because it's precisely this issue of, is there some context when dealing with an illiterate population, a population that you can't just give red text too, how do you end up getting this?
So
this type of
one way in which we've tried this, but we weren't actually controlling the lexical material that you are. So I don't know whether it's realistic, but if you have pictures, and the pictures are not shared between the two, so I know for your words you might not be it might not be feasible, but like that's the trick one could use.
Yeah, no, the individual pictures for a lot of things end up being having other issues. I'd be happy to talk about that issue with you in the question later on.
John Barnes, Boston University. I think you make a very convincing case that there's not anything that looks like phonologized intonation in this language. And in some ways that makes it sort of a perfect laboratory for the search for unphonologized intonation. Right. You could think of, so I'm thinking, and I mentioned this to you before, I'm thinking of Carlos Gussenhoven's biological codes, which he thinks of as kind of some sort of precursors to phonologized intonation. So do you see things like, I wonder if you would see things like pitch range, for example, fluctuating in some sort of more global, less structure-dependent way in response to things like, I'm very enthusiastic about the thing I'm saying right now, therefore my whole pitch range has expanded for the duration of the utterance, or I'm giving you a parenthetical aside right now and I've compressed my pitch range to tell you that this isn't part of it, or I'm being submissive or polite or something and my pitch range is fluctuating in a way that shows that in a sort of global, unphonologized kind of way.
Mm-hmm. My impression is that there is some of that, and I mean, I mentioned final particles earlier. Yeah. There is one, my impression is that during the utterance, people might be speaking very clearly if they're very excited about it. They're speaking very clearly and maybe they're increasing speech rate, but there are certain final particles where you might get, on that final particle itself, that's where the emotional content comes out. So I'm thinking of one final particle that is used in thousands of declaratives all over it's used all over the place, which is yue, which is tone 3-2 at the end of the utterance. And in more excited speech, that might be raised or lowered. I've certainly heard that. And so it might be that it ends up being really restricted to something that's already carrying pragmatic information. I have to look at that. So and then maybe there's other register things, but I haven't found it, at least with these sorts of phenomena.